We once thought, I suppose, if you take the Tom Friedman famous phrase about the flat world, that when there was economic convergence, when the emerging economies were rising, that the convergence of patterns of growth, a large global middle class, would somehow lead to a flat world that was harmoniously interdependent in some way. And in fact, we've seen the opposite. We've seen the convergence is leading to divergence. That as countries become more strong economically, they assert themselves culturally, politically, and militarily. We see it in Russia. We certainly see it in China. We see it in neo-Ottoman Turkey, perhaps. So along with this convergence now comes a divergence. And that brings us to the issue of the global governance issues. Is this idea we have of interdependence and harmony is reminiscent to many people of the talk in April 1914 before World War broke out in June. That interdependence was too great for this kind of conflict to emerge. And we've seen now in the East China Sea, we've seen obviously in Crimea that this idea is pretty fragile. So Frank, I'm sure you have maybe comments on the other things, but why don't you, if you have something on the other stuff, say it, and then let's hear what you think about what are the gaps in global governance, what are the vacuums of power that need to be filled on the global governance level?
Well, I think the world is changing in front of our eyes right now. I think this idea that globalization and interdependence would automatically buy political peace was always an illusion. I mean, this is the Norman Angell hypothesis right on the eve of World War I. And I think that politics proceeds on a very different track. And so what you see all over the world is a significant rise of nationalism. And in fact, it's the growth of the global economy that's fueled this, because in China's case, they're not any more aggressive or imperialistic than any other country. They're just big. They're just big. And they've gotten much bigger after the financial crisis in 2007-8. The West, United States and Europe, did very badly. They survived and continue to grow at very high rates. And they say to themselves, look, we were always a great power. We suffered this century of humiliation. Now we're back, and nobody wants to recognize that. And so it's a direct function of the prosperity brought about by globalization that you now have this big imbalance of power growing in East Asia. Russia is not as powerful, but they recovered. They recovered from the 1990s, and they now, I think, have set a terrible precedent. And I am not the least. I mean, if George Friedman said it's all going to be over in 10 years, I think he's wrong, because I think they've really they've upended the post-Cold War territorial settlement in Eastern Europe, and we're going to be paying and it's not us so much, it's the people that live in that part of the world that are going to be paying a very heavy price for this. Now, to use the word, well, what are the gaps in global governance? I think that's the wrong framework to think about this stuff, because global governance is the word you use for the G20, how to manage, international capital flows in this nice economic interdependent world. I think we're back to a geopolitical world. This is an argument that our colleague Walter Russell Mead has made fairly strongly, that old-fashioned geopolitics is back, and when you talk about global governance, actually what you need are a bunch of strategic military alliances at this point, I think. And so what kind of global governance do you need to deal with Russia? Well, I think we need to take NATO seriously. In fact, the problem with NATO up until now, I mean, since the end of the Cold War, the trouble is that we've regarded NATO as a global governance institution. It's just kind of a club of democracies, and if you get in, you're certified as a democracy, and we stopped thinking about it as a military alliance. And I think we got to do that again, because Estonia has 30% Russian-speaking population, just like many of Russia's neighbors. They're all going to be vulnerable to those same kinds of calls, revanchist calls to reunite with Russia. And we have not had a serious, military exercise trying to figure out how you defend any of these countries, given that we made that very solemn commitment. I think in East Asia, I just think that the economists and the business community have got their heads in the sand, because there's been such a big increase in nationalism in China, Japan, and Korea over the past 3-4 years. It's really, really scary. And so typically people will say, well, and this is the Norman Angell logic, that it's completely irrational for anybody to get into a fight over these rocks, in the Western Pacific, but it was irrational for anyone to get into, August 1914, start of World War I. And I can imagine many scenarios in which you would have short-term military conflict in that region that would have devastating consequences. And again, you don't need global governance. I think what you need is a multilateral mechanism to resolve territorial disputes that will box China in. And that's kind of what the struggle in East Asia is right now, that the Chinese just want to deal with everyone on a bilateral basis because then they can strong-arm everybody. And so what I think we need is kind of a certain degree of solidarity, which means Japan and Korea have to stop, the stupid, fighting, and we need to work closely with ASEAN and revive, some of the existing mechanisms that are out there.
Let me go back to, I want to bring it back to democracy and what the public's willing to do and what they're willing to support or not support. Recently, Condi Rice said in the interview with the World Post that we all thought that when she was criticizing Obama, say that when Obama came to power, everything would be fine. If we just backed off from the world, the good guys would fill the gaps. And in fact, it's the nationalists and the populists and neo-fascists that are filling the gaps. So yesterday, Obama's defending himself, not just against Condi Rice, but other people saying, you're not doing what you're saying, actually. And Obama says, well, we fought 2 exhaustive wars, and the polls are with Obama. The people say, I don't want to go fight for Ukraine. Frank Fukuyama and those crazy neoconservatives want us to go to war again. So a democracy, unlike after World War II, when the public trusted elites enough to build an international system, we don't have that now. So that's one question. And the other one is related is, well, that one first. And
so
anybody else who wants this?
The democracy thing is a red herring. This is just a question of leadership. There's no reason. So, the United States has gone through these cycles. After Vietnam, we also got tired of extended involvements, and you had the Carter administration, and then, Ronald Reagan turned things around. If you read the poll data on the eve of that 1980 election, most Americans were, they wouldn't come to the defense of our NATO allies, even though we committed ourselves. But, you put a different argument out there, and you just do it. And I think in terms of financial resources, there's no reason that we couldn't afford a more, we don't want a militarized policy, but we have the resources to have a policy that shows solidarity with other democratic countries around the world. The deficit will be fixed by entitlement reform. It will not be fixed on the back of the defense budget. There's just no way that that's going to happen. And therefore, I think, with the right domestic policies and the right international leadership, there's absolutely no reason why the United States shouldn't play the kind of role it's traditionally played, I think, since the end of World War II.
Neil?
I mean, I agree with Frank. I think the president makes a very bad argument, and he did it in a very thin-skinned and defensive response to a question yesterday. Every time anybody suggests the mere threat of military force, he says you want to do Iraq again. But nobody's proposing to do Iraq in the case of Ukraine. Nobody was proposing to do Iraq in the case of Syria. So this defense is wearing thin. In practice, what the president has done has been to take even the threat of military force off the table. He stood up in September and gave an astonishing press conference, or rather address to the nation, in which he argued for not taking action against Assad, despite the fact that Assad had crossed his own red line on the use of chemical weapons. And that sent an extraordinarily bad signal to the rest of the world. He said it twice in that address: the United States is not the global policeman. If you keep telling people that the United States is not the global policeman, it's rather similar to saying the LAPD will not be patrolling the streets of LA this year. And that's essentially what we've seen. Since that address, the incentives for aggression have gone up. Even now, with Russia playing a kind of 1930s-style system of disruption on Ukraine's eastern frontier, having annexed Crimea with impunity, what does the president have to offer? Tighter sanctions. And yet there were perfectly credible military options on the table. At the very least, a meeting of NATO leaders, at the very least, the deployment of some US naval assets to make Putin consider the possibility that there might be some military risk to what he was doing. But there was no military risk. There still is no military risk to what Putin is doing. I think it's an extremely lamentable show of weakness that we are currently dealing with. And I've said before, and I'll repeat it today, the geopolitical taper is far more serious than the Fed taper. We are tapering American power, and already the consequences are clear. And I totally agree with Frank. The really scary scenario is what happens in East Asia as a consequence of this geopolitical taper, as both Japan feels insecure and China feels provoked. I think the 2014-1914 parallel is helpful in one way at least. Many people try to draw this analogy who don't know 1914 well. I know it well. The key problem in 1914 was that Britain did not make it clear to its quasi-allies what it was going to do, nor did it make it clear what it was going to do to the Germans. And the uncertainty of the summer of 1914, which ultimately produced war in August, not June. June was the assassination, August was the war, was because the dominant English-speaking empire of the day thought it was too weak to have a credible strategy. Its strategy failed disastrously in 1914, and I worry that in the same way, a strategy of weakness on the part of the United States is going to have a disastrous, epic fail, maybe this year.
Talking about the shifting world order, the so-called BRICS, China, Russia, India, South Africa, said we're not going to do this in the G20. We're not going to isolate Russia. How does that play into this ability of the U.S. to lead and to show that it's a powerful country still when all these emerging economies we've been celebrating for the last 2 decades are now saying we're not going to play that game?
Well, there's been a steady erosion of American ability to use things like sanctions to get its ways, and this started way before the current crisis. So if you look at Sudan, we tried to sanction Sudan for 20 years over terrorism and Darfur and so forth, and you couldn't do it because the Chinese were backfilling and willing to fund any project that we pulled out of. So I think what it does is it weakens our ability to shape events. On the other hand, the BRICS is not a political movement. It's just an acronym thought up by a securities analyst. I mean, they have no
offense.
They have no natural
financial security analyst.
Financial security, yes.
They have no natural commonality of interest except that all of them are vaguely anti-American and enjoy rubbing America's nose in the fact that we can't, get our way all the time. But between Russia and China, there are territorial issues. There are major, issues of population along their border. Brazil is basically a democracy and has, very different kinds of moral interests from the Chinese and so forth. And so that's the one respect in which I think the world really is very different, that you don't have a systematic underlying clash of big ideas right now going on. What you've got is a lot of different countries with their own national interests, their own nationalisms. And so in some ways, we are kind of returning to a 19th century world where you don't have big bifurcations, but you've got a lot of little centers of power. The question, I guess the global governance question is, how do you manage that? And I think one of the issues that the way it was managed in the 19th century was actually not through formal agreements, but by maintaining a balance of power among these different power centers. And that actually produced a reasonably moderate world. It broke down by the time of World War I because one of those powers got to be so big. But so there are natural balancing mechanisms, I think, that are out there, even apart from these formal institutions.
Let me give that last question to Neil, since you're working on this biography of Kissinger, and balance of power and Kissinger are synonymous in most people's minds. But Kissinger also is very much into cooperation and coordination with China and avoiding conflict between the U.S. and China, maybe so far as a G2 even. What are your thoughts on instead of ramping up the conflict with China, in some kind of a condominium with China?
Well, anybody who's read Kissinger on China knows that the final part of the argument makes an explicit reference to 1914. He quotes the famous Air-Crow Memorandum, which was the famous memorandum by a British diplomat arguing that the rise of Germany was the biggest challenge that the United Kingdom faced. And I think in the same way, he rightly argues that the rise of China is the biggest challenge that US foreign policy faces. And we do not have a coherent strategy. Now, you can call it the G2, or if you prefer my term, Chimerica. The relationship between China and America is the most important relationship for our world today. If that goes wrong, then all bets are effectively off. I worry that we do not yet have a coherent strategy, and currently we are doing a kind of containment light, judging by the president's recent tour, which isn't credible. And I think to do containment light without credibility is the worst possible strategy, because you neither reassure your allies really. I don't think the Japanese have felt much reassurance from the president's recent visit, but at the same time you irk and antagonize the rising power. The argument in Kissinger's book is for what he calls co-evolution, which I take to mean an accommodation of China's rise. And I have to say that the lesson of history is pretty clear. That must be preferable to collision. And if there's one thing we should all fervently wish to avoid, that's more obvious on the Pacific coast than on the Atlantic coast, it's that kind of collision that ultimately brought Britain and Germany to world war not once but twice. So it seems to me extraordinary but true that a man approaching his 91st birthday still has the most profound things to say about the international system and is still offering a more coherent strategy for the United States than the president or his national security advisors seem capable of devising.
Okay, I'm going to end this conversation just by bringing it all back to the beginning with a question. We don't have time to answer, but we can go on debating it. Maybe we will. I'm not convinced, Frank, that it's a matter of leadership. We live in a consumer society. We live in a society of networks. We live in a society that's, in some ways, a diet culture. We want sweetness without calories. We want consumption without savings. We want world order and security without war, without military spending. So democracy is inextricably linked to the ability of the U.S. to play a leading role in this current environment. And I'm not convinced that the public is where Frank Fukuyama is. That's an open question. We'll leave it at that unless someone has an answer real quick. Okay, good. Thank you very much.
Okay.